Hi everyone, this is your lecture video on the failure of Gilded Age labor protest. First, I would like to acknowledge that the reading from digital history may seem a bit contradictory to you because the sections on the rise of big business emphasize the vast expansion of the nation's economic productivity and the benefits that many American workers enjoyed by 1929 as a result of a growing economic pie and all of the technological advancements of the previous 6 decades. Therefore, it may seem strange that given all of these positive developments that there was so much unrest and so much discontent among industrial workers and tenant farmers and sharecroppers. As you review the reading, I would say keep in mind this question: how did these populations experience those changes at the time? The big picture of economic growth and advancement by the end of the era or even during the era, it's important because the United States is moving from really a position of being a second-rate power in the mid 19th century to being a first-rate global economic force by the 20th century. But that does not tell us much about the conditions and worldviews of the people who joined these movements as these changes were unfolding. The transformations of the late 19th century brought new opportunities and new dangers. Why did these protesting workers and farming people feel that this was a dangerous time, a time of action? Their anxieties are rooted in material concerns, as your reading points out and details, physical concerns, and cultural concerns. They also worried that, as your reading put it, the very meaning of American democracy was at stake. So what does that mean? Think about that as you review. Despite the magnitude of these movements, most of their demands went unmet. Some elements of the populist platform were realized, but these come to pass much later. In the 19-teens, a generation after the populist movement had crumbled. A central demand of industrial workers was for a 12-hour day or a 10-hour day or an 8-hour day. This generated enthusiastic support, and some states passed laws limiting the hours of labor. But the crucial thing was that federal judges in the Supreme Court in the late 19th century overturned most of this legislation, as well as other restrictions on industry. And it's this that brings us to one of the chief reasons that Gilded Age protests failed. The aims of the protesters clashed with the laissez-faire ideas that dominated the thinking of Gilded Age Americans, especially federal judges. Laissez-faire ideology held that the government has no business intervening in economic questions, that to do so would violate the natural workings of the market and ultimately wreak economic havoc. Thus, very little in the way of labor regulation and protection survived review of the courts, and much of what did survive lacked enforcement. Laissez-faire doctrine did endorse government intervention to protect private property and prevent revolution. So there were many large-scale strikes of the era that were lost due to government intervention on the side of industry. I should say that while to some extent the state and federal governments intervened in response to real violence by strikers and their supporters, the arrival of troops and the role of troops in weakening the strike effort, really breaking those strike efforts, and also using lethal force in their confrontation with pro-strike crowds, had the effect of sparking much larger waves of anger and violence. Also, in many instances, the government intervened in ways that favored employers, even when strikers were peaceable. The association in the public mind between violence and labor protest was another factor that weakened Gilded Age labor movements. Many middle-class Americans came to fear the social upheavals associated with strikes. The fact that a large number of industrial workers were German or Bohemian or Irish and later Italian or Russian particularly alarmed native-born middle-class Americans who saw these immigrant groups as alien, dangerous, radicalized populations. Also, labor competition intensified among workers. As the late 19th century wore on, workers competed increasingly for both skilled and unskilled positions in a fast-changing labor market. As transportation systems improved, like the railways and the steamship lines, employers were more easily able to bring in workers from across the country, from across the ocean, to replace striking employees. Finally, the division among workers along lines of skill, race, ethnicity, religion, and sex made a unified movement very difficult to sustain. In the South, this was especially the case, so that white Democrats were able to break the back of the Populist Party by stoking white racial hatred and backing legislation that cemented the Jim Crow system of segregation, mass disenfranchisement, and they also supported epidemic racial violence in the South. That's not the end of the story, of course. There's much more to it than that. We will see these things change in sometimes dramatic ways during the Progressive Era, and especially the New Deal era. So on that note, I will sign off. Have a great weekend. Thank you.